Now I want to tell you a story my grandmother used to tell me, sitting by the wood stove on nights when the wind came howling down off the mountains. She always swore it was true. So pull your chair a little closer to the fire, and I'll tell it to you the way she told it to me. It was the winter of 1887. She'd out in a little cattle town called Prosper Creek, tucked up against the Wyoming foothills where the wind never seemed to rest, and the snow came down sideways more often than straight. Prosper Creek wasn't much to look at. A dusty main street that turned to frozen mud in the cold months, a mercantile, a church with a bell that had a crack in it so it rang flat, and a bank with a brass sign so polished you could see your own poverty reflected back at you if you stood too close. And it was in front of that very bank, on the coldest morning anyone could remember, that Sarah Hollis stood clutching her daughter's hand. Sarah was a widow of 28 years, though the hard winters and harder grief had put lines around her eyes that made her look older. Her husband, Thomas, had been thrown from a broke horse 2 summers back and never woke up again, leaving her with 60 acres of scrubland, a leaking cabin, and a well that was, as it turned out, about to become the most valuable piece of ground in the whole territory, though nobody had told her that yet. Her daughter, Emma, was 7 years old, with hair the color of wheat straw and eyes like her father's, gray as a winter sky. That morning Emma wore a coat that had been let out at the seams twice and still didn't quite cover her wrists, and boots stuffed with newspaper to keep the cold from creeping through the cracked leather. Sarah herself wore a shawl gone thin as a church whisper, wrapped twice around her shoulders and pinned with a bit of bent wire where the clasp had broken off. They'd come to town for flour and coal oil, walking the 3 miles in because the mule had gone lame, and they were passing the front of the bank just as the Pemberton family was climbing down from their fine black carriage. Now, Randall Pemberton was the richest man in 3 counties, or so everyone believed. On account of he owned the bank and dressed like it. Fur-collared coat, gold watch chain thick as a man's finger. Boots so clean they never seemed to touch actual dirt. His wife, Constance, wore a dress the color of a ripe plum with a matching hat crowned in feathers, and their daughter Prudence, a girl of about Emma's age, wore a coat trimmed in rabbit fur with a matching muff to keep her hands warm. Prudence took one look at Emma's patched coat and newspaper, stuffed boots, and let out a laugh sharp as a slap. "Mama, look," she said, loud enough for half the street to hear. "It's the ragpicker's girl." Constance Pemberton didn't scold her daughter. She smiled, the way a cat smiles at something it's already decided to eat. "Now, Prudence, don't stare, It isn't polite to look too long at charity cases." She said the last 2 words like they tasted of something spoiled, and loud enough that a knot of townsfolk gathering on the boardwalk turned to look, and some of them, not all, but some, laughed along, the way people will laugh when they're afraid of being thought unkind if they don't. Sarah felt her face go hot despite the cold, and she pulled Emma a little closer. Feeling the girl's small shoulders trembling, not from the wind, but from something worse. She said nothing. What was there to say? She had 30 cents in her coat pocket and a girl to feed, and pride doesn't buy flour. But Emma looked up at Prudence's fine rabbit fur muff, and then down at her own boots, and something in her small face folded inward like a flower closing against frost. Sarah saw it happen. She would remember that look for the rest of her days. It was right about then that a big man in a plain gray coat came out of the mercantile across the street, carrying a sack of feed corn over one shoulder like it weighed nothing at all, and stopped stock, still on the boardwalk watching. His name was Jedediah Calloway, though most folks just called him Cal, and there wasn't a soul in 3 territories who'd have guessed, looking at him, that he was worth more money than the whole town of Prosper Creek put together twice over. He dressed like any working cattleman. Canvas coat gone soft with wear, a hat that had seen 15 winters, and boots that had clearly stepped in every kind of muck a ranch could offer. He owned the Circle C, the biggest cattle operation in 4 counties. But he still rode fence himself in bad weather and ate at the same table as his hands. What almost nobody knew, and this is the part my grandmother always leaned in close to tell, like she was letting you in on a secret, was that Cal Calloway also held the largest single block of shares in the Transcontinental Western Railroad. The very railroad that was fixing to run a spur line straight through this stretch of the territory. He'd bought in quiet, through a lawyer back east, because he'd learned a long time ago that a man's money flies the moment folks know about it, and he preferred to be underestimated. It let him see people as they truly were. And what he saw that morning, watching Constance Pemberton smile her cat, smile at a widow and a little girl in a patched coat, told him everything he needed to know about the Pembertons. He didn't say a word. He just watched Sarah Hollis gather what dignity she had left, take her daughter's hand, and walk on past the bank without so much as a glance at the people laughing behind her. Her spine was straight as a fence post the whole way. Cal Calloway noticed that too. He set down his sack of corn, and he followed at a distance, the way a man might follow a hawk he was curious about, not wanting to spook it. Now here is where the story does what good stories do, and turns a corner you didn't expect. Randall Pemberton wasn't laughing at the widow Hollis because he thought poorly of poor folks in general. He was laughing at her because he needed her humiliated. She needed her small and quiet and grateful for whatever crumbs came her way. Because Randall Pemberton had discovered something about Sarah Hollis's 60 acres of scrubland that Sarah herself didn't know. Her well, the same well Thomas Hollis had dug with his own hands the year before he died, sat directly atop the only reliable year-round water source for 15 miles in any direction. And the railroad survey, which Pemberton had gotten wind of through a cousin who clerked in the Territorial Land Office, showed that the rail spur into Prosper Creek would need exactly that water to run its steam engines and serve the depot they planned to build. Whoever held that water right stood to make a fortune leasing it to the railroad. Pemberton meant for that whoever to be himself. His plan was simple and cruel, in the way that plans made by comfortable men often are. He'd been quietly buying up the widow's small debts, a note here, a mercantile bill there, and calling them due all at once, hoping to force her into a foreclosure so he could buy the land at auction for pennies, water rights and all, before anyone else in town caught wind of what that scrubland was really worth. The public mockery wasn't accidental either. A woman shamed and desperate is a woman who signs whatever paper is put in front of her. Pemberton had been playing that long game for the better part of a year, patient as a spider. What he didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that the railroad he meant to profit from was substantially owned by the very cattleman standing quiet across the street with a sack of feed corn at his feet. That night, the temperature dropped so low that the water buckets froze solid in the barns, and the wind came shrieking down off the foothills carrying loose snow that stung like thrown gravel. Sarah Hollis was in her cabin, feeding the last of the split wood into the stove, when she heard a horse outside, and her heart went straight to her throat, because a rider on a night like that could only mean trouble. She took up the shotgun from beside the door. Thomas's old shotgun, which she'd never once fired but kept loaded all the same, and opened the door a crack. It was Randall Pemberton, wrapped in his fur-collared coat, his breath coming out in great white clouds, his horse blowing steam. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, not bothering to dismount. "I'll come straight to it, seeing as it's cold. You owe 4 debts around town, come due together. Come the 1st of the month, I'm prepared to buy the whole of your land, cabin, well, and all, for $200, and forgive every note besides. That's more than fair, given the state of things. Sarah felt the cold reach clear into her chest. $200 wouldn't keep her and Emma through 2 winters, let alone a lifetime. And she knew. The way a body knows a storm is coming by the ache in old bones. That Pemberton wouldn't ride out on a night like this for a fair deal. Fair deals didn't need midnight and no witnesses. I'll need time to think on it, she said. There's no time left to think on, Mrs. Hollis. The first of the month is 11 days off. His horse stamped and blew. I'd hate to see you and that girl out in this weather with nothing at all. Sign now, and I'll see you're taken care of. It was right then that another set of hoofbeats came up through the dark, slow and unhurried, and a second rider emerged out of the blowing snow, big, broad-shouldered, sitting his horse like he'd grown there. Evening. Randall, said Cal Calloway. Bit late for banking, ain't it? Pemberton's face did something complicated in the lantern light. Calloway. This doesn't concern you. Might, Cal said easy, like he was discussing weather. Seeing as I hold considerable interest in a certain railroad spur that's fixing to need water out this way. Funny thing about water rights. Randall. They've got a way of making quiet men loud with greed. He looked past Pemberton to Sarah, standing in her doorway with the shotgun still in her hand and Emma peering out from behind her skirts, wide-eyed. Ma'am, I'd be obliged if you didn't sign anything tonight. Not tonight, and not for $200 neither. Pemberton's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Cal said, and something in his voice had gone quiet and hard as creek ice. I know your cousin clerks the land office. I know the survey lines. And I know a man doesn't ride out in a blizzard to be generous. He tipped his hat toward Sarah. Mrs. Hollis, I'd count it a kindness if you'd come see me at the Circle C when the weather breaks. No obligation. Just come see me. Pemberton sat his horse a moment longer, looking for words that wouldn't come, then wheeled around and rode off into the dark without another word, his horse's hoofbeats swallowed quick by the wind. Sarah stood in the doorway shaking, from cold, from fear, from something that might have been the first small ember of hope she'd felt in 2 years. Why? She asked, before he could turn to go. Why would you help us? Kyle Calloway looked at her for a long moment, the snow settling on his shoulders. Saw you and your girl on the street this morning, he said. Saw how you kept your back straight when folks who ought to know better were laughing at you. That's not a thing charity can buy, ma'am. That's a thing worth protecting. And with that, he rode off into the storm, leaving Sarah standing in her doorway, with her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in a long, long time. Word travels strange in a small town, slow as molasses on some things, fast as wildfire on others, and somehow within the week. Half of Prosper Creek had heard that the widow Hollis had turned away Randall Pemberton's midnight offer. Some folks clucked their tongues and said she was a fool. Others, mostly the women who'd watched Constance Pemberton's cat smile with quiet discomfort of their own, began to wonder, for the first time, what exactly the banker was so eager to get his hands on. Cal Calloway, meanwhile, did something that mattered more to Sarah than any amount of money could have. He didn't send flour. He didn't send coal or blankets or a check with a note attached. Instead, he sent word that the Circle C was short-handed for the winter and needed someone reliable to keep the ranch's books. A job, he said. That paid a fair wage and came with a snug little house on the property, heated proper. Close enough to town that Emma could still attend the schoolhouse. It wasn't charity. It was work, and work that Sarah, who'd kept her own family's accounts sharp as any clerk for years, was more than capable of doing. She took the job. And when the first Sunday came around that she and Emma had money enough for something beyond flour and coal oil, Cal, through the seamstress in town, Mrs. Abernathy, and not through his own hand. Because he understood the difference between a gift and a debt, arranged for a dress to be made for Emma. Deep blue wool, warm as a hearth, with a collar of soft rabbit fur not so different from the one Prudence Pemberton had worn that cold morning, and small pearl buttons that caught the light. I want you to picture it, the way my grandmother always described it. Emma standing in front of the cracked mirror in the little house on the Circle C, turning this way and that in her new dress, her wheat straw hair catching the lamplight. And something happened in that girl's face and shoulders and spine that hadn't happened since the day on the boardwalk. She stood up straight. She lifted her chin. She looked at herself in that mirror, not like a girl waiting to be laughed at, but like a girl who belonged wherever she chose to stand.
"Mama,"
she said, "I don't feel like the ragpicker's girl anymore." Sarah had to turn away so Emma wouldn't see her cry. Now? The water rights business came to its head in February, in the Prosper Creek Bank itself. And folks still talk about that day, the way they'd talk about a hanging or a wedding. Something that shifted the whole shape of the town. Randall Pemberton, growing desperate as his scheme unraveled thread by thread, had called a public meeting of the town council to force through an emergency purchase of the Hollis land under eminent domain, claiming it was needed for civic waterworks. He stood behind his own polished counter like a judge behind a bench. Constance at his side in a hat, with even more feathers than before, and half the town crowded into the bank lobby to watch, breath fogging in the cold room despite the stove crackling in the corner. The plain fact, Pemberton announced, is that the widow's land holds water this town requires for its future. I am prepared, out of civic duty, to purchase it at fair market value and see the water properly managed for the good of all Prosper Creek. There was a murmur through the crowd, some approving, some uncertain. And Sarah Hollis stood near the back in her plain coat, Emma's small gloved hand in hers, feeling very much like she was standing again on that cold boardwalk, with the whole town's eyes on her. That was when the door opened and Cal Calloway walked in unhurried, snow still on his shoulders. And behind him came a lawyer from Cheyenne carrying a leather satchel thick with papers. "Randall," Cal said, "before this town votes away a widow's land for the public good, I believe the public ought to know exactly whose good we're talking about." He nodded to the lawyer, who opened his satchel and began laying documents on the counter. Survey maps, correspondence, and a letter, its wax seal broken. From the Transcontinental Western Railroad's Board of Directors, addressed to Randall Pemberton and marked confidential. This letter, Cal said, loud enough to carry to every corner of that crowded room, shows that Randall Pemberton has known for the better part of a year that the Hollis well sits atop the water source the railroad needs for its new spur line. It shows he's been quietly buying up Mrs. Hollis's debts, hoping to force a foreclosure and secure that water for himself, not for this town, but to lease back to the railroad at a fat profit, while calling it civic duty in front of decent folks. The room went dead quiet, the kind of quiet where you could hear the stove popping and every held breath in the place. "And how?" Pemberton said, his voice gone thin. "Would you know the contents of a confidential railroad letter?" Cal Calloway reached into his coat and produced a folded document of his own and set it on the counter beside the others. "Because I hold controlling interest in that railroad, Randall. Have for 3 years. Quiet, the way I prefer to do most things. Which means the decision on where that spur line runs and who it deals with for water sits with me.
"Not you."
He let that settle a moment. "And I'll tell you plain in front of God and this whole town's. I've no interest in doing business with a man who'd starve a widow and mock a little girl in the street to line his own pockets. Constance Pemberton's feathered hat seemed to wilt right there on her head. Someone in the back of the room, it might have been the seamstress, Mrs. Abernathy, or it might have been half a dozen women all at once, let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a bitter little laugh. The railroad, Cal went on, will lease Mrs. Hollis's water rights directly from Mrs. Hollis at fair market terms. Same as it would from any landowner. She'll keep her land. She'll keep her well. And this town's council might do well to ask itself how many other quiet foreclosures Mr. Pemberton has arranged over the years, and for whose good. I won't drag out for you every last detail of what happened after. My grandmother never did either. Said the ending was the part folks remembered best, and the middle could take care of itself. But I'll tell you the shape of it. The town council, once it got a good look at those documents, didn't so much vote as scramble to distance itself from Randall Pemberton as fast as decency allowed. Within the month, the bank's board, men who'd been happy enough to let Pemberton run things so long as it profited them, voted him out of his own institution, and word got around, as word does, about the debts he'd quietly bought up around town and the families he'd squeezed. Some of those families found their notes mysteriously forgiven not long after, though nobody could ever get Carl Calloway to admit to arranging it. Sarah Hollis signed a lease with the Transcontinental Western Railroad that gave her more money in a single year than she and Thomas had seen in 5 years of scraping together a living. And she used it wisely, fixed the roof, bought a proper mule, put money by for Emma's schooling, and eventually didn't need the bookkeeping job at the Circle C at all, though she kept it on anyway, because she'd come to like the work, and because Cal Calloway had become, by then, more than just an employer. That, though, is a whole different story, and one my grandmother always said belonged to Sarah alone to tell. As for Emma, well, I already told you about the dress. But I'll tell you one more thing. Years later, when Emma Hollis was grown and had a girl of her own, she kept that deep blue wool dress folded in cedar in the bottom of a trunk, gone soft and small with time, and she used to take it out on cold nights and tell her daughter the story of the winter her mother stood up straight in front of a mean little town, and the winter a quiet millionaire in a plain gray coat decided that dignity was worth more than any amount of money, and set about proving it. And that, my grandmother always said, settling back in her chair with the fire gone down to embers, is the heart of the whole story. If you want it boiled down small enough to carry in your pocket, it was never really about the water, or the land, or even the money. Randall Pemberton had all three and stood revealed, in the end, as a small and frightened man. Sarah Hollis had none of them, that cold morning on the boardwalk, and stood taller than anyone in that whole laughing crowd. Pride? Real pride. The kind that isn't puffed up with money or fine feathered hats. Doesn't come from what's in your pocket or on your back. It comes from somewhere further in, someplace the cold can't quite reach. You can lose a husband, lose a harvest, lose every dollar you ever had, and if you keep your spine straight and your chin level, there isn't a soul on God's earth who can take your dignity from you unless you hand it over yourself. That's the whole of it. That's why she told it every winter, sitting by the stove with the wind howling outside, just like it was that long ago night. Not because it was a story about a fortune won, but because it was a story about a woman who never once bent, even when she had nothing left to stand on but her own 2 feet and the truth. She now banked that fire down and get on to bed. Cold's coming in,